you got it set up right now. The way people will be feeling better again. I'm just saying I like the.
That's right. There she is. Cheers.
Good morning. Good morning. Hi, I'm Robin Banks. I'm the Director of Communications here at Calvary Episcopal Church. Welcome to all of you in the room and online. This morning we have Dr. Jennifer Shuba with us as our guest speaker. And I had to make notes, y'all, because she is amazing and has done so many things. She is one of the foremost experts in political demography. She's the author of 8 Billion and Counting. If you haven't picked up this book, highly recommend it. They have it at Novel on Amazon. She's had articles in the Washington Post, the Atlantic. She's been on a podcast with Ezra Klein, among others. She's been interviewed by the BBC and CNN, and she's been on the TED stage. She's done a TED Talk. Y'all, she is just amazing. She is a formerly tenured professor at Rhodes College. She is a demographics consultant to she was a demographics consultant to the U.S. Office Secretary of Defense. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a fellow at the Wilson Center, and as of this week, she is the new president and CEO of the Population Reference Bureau in Washington, D.C.
Wow.
I know, it's amazing. She is also one of my very best friends and is one of the best people. So, y'all listen, she has some amazing things to say.
Thank you. I said I wanted Robin to come with me for just minimal AV help, but now I'm going to add, please come with me just to be the hype girl. Because you know what? Also on the Sunday morning, probably we need such a thing to bring some energy here. I am so pleased to be with all of you today. Calvary was the first place we landed when we moved to Memphis 16 years ago, which is how I met Robin. So hi, and both of my kids were baptized here, so this is great for me. I am going to start by telling you a little bit about how I got into global population, which may be something you're wondering, like this person seems awfully passionate about a subject that we would assume is very boring. So in 1999, I was a student in my favorite professor's classroom at Agnes Scott College in Atlanta. And on this particular day, she was extra late. She was always late because she was eccentric. And this is back in the day when we had to wait for our professors to come. Now they don't. So when she finally got there, she stopped in the doorway and waited for everyone's eyes to turn to her. And when we did, we noticed she was wearing a black armband. And then she started marching military style in front of our desk, and she said, "Today world population has hit 6 billion people. This is an absolute travesty for our planet. I never had children because there are too many people, and you shouldn't either." Other things we are not allowed to do. I did not heed her warning. I have the two, as I mentioned, but I was really hooked by her passion, particularly that she would make a deep life commitment to this principle about population. And so I've spent my career trying to understand the power of this underlying trend to shape everything else about society. I mean, that's the subtitle here, How Sex, Death, and Migration Shape Our World. And I think it shapes absolutely everything for us. But I've come to notice also that while we all know a little something about demographics, a lot of what we think we know is not exactly true. And that's because there's a difference between just a trend itself in sex, death, and migration and what it actually means, how context specific it is. And so what I'm going to walk through today are some common myths, 3 myths about population issues, and then some truths about that. So first of all, we'll make sure we're all on the same page. we're gonna just do a quick 101 on how populations change. It is easy. It is the sex, death, and migration part. And so I like to think of these as 3 dials that turn up or down in different intensities to produce different outcomes. So you might have high fertility rates, we'll call them, average number of children born per woman. That might be high, and the mortality rate is also high, then the population doesn't really grow very fast. If the mortality rate goes down and fertility rate is still high, the population grows quite quickly, and of course you can imagine turning any of those will change those outcomes for us. What does this look like on the global scale? And I'll tell you everything that's on here in case you can't read it. Basically, as we hit these billion milestones, this is how long it took. For Earth to house its first 1 billion people, it took from all of human history until around the year 1800 for that to happen. Which, if you are a history nerd, is when Malthus wrote his essays on the principles of population, coincidentally. It took then only 123 years to get that second billion. And then you see these shorter bars. It started happening really quickly. In fact, in the 20th century, we started with 1.6 billion people on the planet and ended with 6.1 billion. So last century was one of exponential population growth. I think this matters for us to take stock of because I've noticed that our first impression of population trends is very sticky. And we were all born into this century. And in fact, you might even be able to find in here when you had a realization like I did in my professor's class that population was important. For some of you, it could have been in the 1960s, and that will be a very powerful force shaping how you view population and resource balances even today. So for me, I was born into a world with only 4 billion people, and now we have 8. So we can see how rapidly that changed. Now, overall, this is the number of people on the planet, but that is actually not the most interesting thing about population. It's the shape. All you need to be able to see here are some gray blobs. So in 1950, this is what the shape of the world population looked like. We've got younger people at the bottom, older people at the top. So you can see in 1950, it's shaped like a pyramid. It's very bottom heavy. That means there are lots of young people, and it's fast growing. Because if you can imagine, right here would be females of reproductive ages. Oh, fun. Oh. Look at Robin, you said it was technical. I should have known better. So when it's pyramid shaped, that means each woman is having more than what we call replacement level. Replacement would be 2 parents, right? So 2 children per woman, roughly, is replacement level. Now, by the time we get to 2023, you notice it's much more stovepipe shaped. That's because globally, we are roughly at replacement level fertility. So the 8 billion people on the planet, the average number of children born per woman is just 2.3. So we get the stovepipe shape. And by the time we get to 2100, we'll be more top heavy. And it's actually not as uncertain as you might think. This is the great thing about demography is many of the people of the future already exist. So it's not very difficult to figure out some of these patterns for us. These shapes are reflected at the national level as well. So we can see here Ethiopia today has this classic pyramid shape, meaning women there have on average, they have about 4 children each. Turkey has more of a stovepipe shape. They have just under replacement level, I think 1.9. But Japan, it's a tree. It's not a pyramid. It's inverted. And that's, you can see, very top-heavy, older population, along with Monaco, the 2 oldest countries on the planet. And so they've had very low fertility rates for a very long time. So myth number 1, actually, is that global population is booming. We might feel like that's the case because we see more and more people kind of piling on top of the planet, especially in our lifetimes. But what we don't see is what's beneath the surface. And that's that the rate of global population change has been falling since the 1960s. So there's something happening underneath the surface that didn't reflect on the top yet, but we're actually at this moment where that's starting to catch up. So, in 1968, when Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, out of the 200 countries in the world, like 120, 130 of them, women had 5 or more children on average. So you can imagine this population bomb mindset. That's a huge number. Today there are only 8 out of 200 countries where women have that many children. It has been a tremendous shift. It's one I've noticed even in my own career, because when I was trying to write this book, you know, you have all these numbers and you try to find novel ways of saying them to make them interesting to other people and to yourself. So I would just count things in different ways than I had counted them before. And this was one for me that floored me. It absolutely floored me that we were down to just 8 countries with fertility rates that high. That's such a huge difference so quickly. In fact, now 2 out of every 3 people on the planet live somewhere with below replacement fertility rates. So there has been a huge change in the world. Here's the problem though. If last century was one of exponential population growth, I would say that this century is one of differential growth, because it's 2 out of 3 people living somewhere with below replacement fertility rates, but of course, there's that 1 out of 3 that does not. So if we look globally at the percentage of the population under 15, so our children, a quarter of the world's population is children. It's actually pretty small when we think about that. 10% are over age 65. But there are huge regional differences. In sub-Saharan Africa, 42% of the population is under 15. And in Western and Southern Europe, currently our oldest region, 21% is over 65. We can see this in a map that just shows in red places where fertility rates are higher, and they're really strongly concentrated in the world's poorest countries, the ones that are experiencing the most conflict, the hardest problems with governance, etc. I do want to point out, though, that sub-Saharan Africa is not one giant block of red. I think that's really important to note, because we see even there have been huge changes in fertility patterns. So it's again, just a swath of countries where it's still higher. It matters that there is this divide, I think, for many reasons. One of them is that I worry about our ability to set global priorities, because the countries that are aging are the world's richest and most powerful countries. They're the furthest along, I would say. They are concerned about how to deal with that at the national level, while we're still dealing with issues of family planning, malaria, communicable diseases that have been eradicated elsewhere. How does that then play out on a global scale? Think about things like pandemics that cross borders, or things like climate change that cross borders. We have this increasing divergence. I think it's something we need to be attuned to make sure we're not seeing a divergence on the global agenda there. Okay, so that's myth number 1. We see that global population, it's still growing, but much more slowly, and it's definitely not growing everywhere. In fact, there are already over 30 shrinking countries. So let's look at myth number 2. And it's pop quiz for you. You can just yell out a number here. What proportion of the world's 8 billion do you think lives outside the country in which they were born? Looking for a percentage number.
25%.
25.
5.
10. 5. 10.
2.
2. You're giving us a couple answers. Okay. Anybody else?
About 30 or 20. 20.
Okay. 20 to 30. I would say these 25, 20 to 30 are the most popular guesses when I ask crowds. The percentage is much lower, going to the back, because myth number 2 is that international migration is common. And we all think it's common, probably based on what's in the news media. Most people stay. Well, in 1995, there were 161 million migrants in the world. That was just under 3% of the world's population. In 2005, we're still just under 3% of the world's population. 2020, 281 million migrants, just under 4% of the world's population. It has consistently been between 2 and 4% of the world's population for decades and decades. But we perceive it generally, with noting the correct answers in the back, generally we perceive it higher. And why do you think that is the case? I think a big reason is that 2/3 of all migrants live in just 20 countries, and more than half are in just 10. So it is very unevenly distributed around the world. The United States has the world's largest stock of migrants at 50 million. So if we're talking a US audience like we are here, the numbers
tend to be higher. I've given this talk in Silicon Valley, and everyone there is like 40, 50%, because they're all from somewhere else. So you tend to assume what you see around you. Actually, us being in the South makes that even more so. So I'm going to tell you what you're seeing here. How did U.S. population change in 2023? It's like mid-2022 to mid-2023. The Northeast shrank. That region shrank. The Midwest grew by 0.2%. The West grew by 0.2%. But our region grew by 1.1%. Also not a lot, by the way. 1.1% is not a lot. Imagine that being your money. You wouldn't be too thrilled. But that 1.1% was 700,000 migrants from within the U.S., people moving elsewhere, and 500,000 international migrants. So again, if I'm asking this question, if you had answered higher, it would make a lot of sense because this is what we experience here. So as you see, migration is not all that common, with 96% of the world's 8 billion people staying put. The trend is uneven around the world, and the U.S. has a lot going on with migration. We also have below replacement fertility. So our latest numbers are 1.6 children per woman on average. I would expect that to keep going a little bit lower year on year. It's happening with all of our peers. Did an interview with a German journalist on Friday who said that I don't think their numbers have come out yet. Oh, the journalists have all the previews, so I get my inside information. They said they're going to announce 1.3. I've talked to some people in South Korea who have 0.7 children per woman on average, and they said their numbers that are about to come out, 0.6. That has not ever been seen in human history, this large-scale shift to this. So what does this mean for the U.S.? The next slide is hard to read, I'm sorry. I just didn't have time to make this one pretty, but I'll tell you what it says. So how might the U.S. population change between now and the end of the century? If we had a scenario, so most of our growth comes from migration, okay, because we're below replacement fertility. Most of our growth comes from migration. And that is a choice. And I can be agnostic to, around this position and just tell you, here's what the different scenarios show. You choose your own adventure. And every country is going to choose their own adventure. Japan's never going to open fully to migrants. They're choosing their own adventure, and they're choosing to shrink and adapt. That's fine. This is just so you know what's coming. If we have a high immigration scenario, between now and the end of the century, we'll grow about 30%. If we have the same kind of immigration we've been having between now and the end of the century, we'll grow about 10%. If we have low immigration, we only shrink by 4%. And if we stopped all immigration right now, we shrink by 32%. So that would be losing a third of the U.S. population between now and the end of the century if we stopped all immigration. But by the way, remember those age structure things? Y'all can come right up here. I know you don't want to. Both teaching and church, same thing. Oh, sit there. That's okay. So just imagine we would just lose a third of the U.S. population, and it would be much older. How does this look at the state level? I think what's important to note, and I travel around to all kinds of cities. I was in Indianapolis last week. Week before last, I went to Cleveland and Peoria. Go to all kinds of places. Everyone in these cities are starting to understand that they won't be growing naturally, meaning births over deaths. So they say, how do we get people to move here? But note, every city and state has the same strategy. How do we get people to move here? Meaning they're all competing over the same exact person. There will be 49 losers and only one winner. And so if you can see these colors from the back of the room, looking from mid-2020 to mid-2023, where were states shrinking and growing? If you see pink, they have already been shrinking. If you see green, they're still growing up to 3.5%. And if you see you can barely see the color there, they are growing slowly or really heading towards shrinking. So we tend to notice state like South Dakota, why would it be growing still? And that had to do with oil boom and young families moving. So specific economic conditions can attract people. Low taxes. People move to places that have lower taxes. The Northeast has always had that
issue, and then, you know, the high cost of living and taxes, et cetera, in California. People have, we all know they went to Nashville, so they didn't come here, but they went to Nashville. Okay, so myth number 2 was migration is common. It is not all that common, and I would add on to that, it's maybe not assured. I would say migration is actually not a demographic issue, it's a political issue. So you can turn the dial however you want to turn it. Myth number 3, the same demographic trend looks the same everywhere. When I actually am a political scientist, so I was training my PhD's government and politics, and so when I really started getting into this issue in graduate school, there was a question about whether or not the size of demographic groups equaled political power. So knowing that populations were starting to age, there was a big question about, as populations got older, would we end up with something called a gerontocracy, or rule by the old? Now it's kind of funny today because we're thinking about the election, and I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, 20 years ago, this is my research question, and I found no, by the way, at that time. I found that actually, and this I hope wouldn't surprise you, but and there's 2 seats up front, that in most societies, older people actually care about groups other than themselves. What do you know? So people tend to have things in common politically, more so regionally. I looked at Japan, Italy, and Germany, which are the oldest countries. But I think 20 years later, this trend is really intensifying. Like, it's a different aging world than it was when I started. But we have some assumptions also about retirement with aging. So I'm going to walk you through these and how it looks different. If we just looked at Japan and France, which are 2 of the world's oldest populations, and these are those age structures again, so young people are on the bottom. The way the UN does it is we've got the ladies in the pink and the men in the blue, and older people up top. So 31% of Japan's population in 2022 was over 65. 31% over 65, and in France, comparatively younger, only 22% over 65. So if you're picking up The Economist or the Wall Street Journal, and they're using things like proportion of population over 65 to tell you everything you need to know about investments, how to run your business, etc., we would assume there are more people retired in, a higher proportion of people retired in Japan than in France. That makes a lot of sense. But putting a political science spin on this, we know that there's far more to leaving the workforce than just the, hitting the magic number of 65. France has become a little bit of a straw man with this if you read the news because of all the protests over the retirement age. But we know that there's different cultures of work. There's different alternative schemes for exiting the workforce early, like you could take disability and get out early, for example. If we really put all of these together, we see that the average age people actually exit the workforce was 71 years in Japan and a full 10 years younger in France, 61. Now, 10-year difference times populations that big is a huge number of people. That means that effectively only a quarter of Japan's population is retired, while 29% of France's is retired. That makes a big difference when you're thinking about projecting needs in terms of Social Security, for example, or healthcare needs. So the same trend doesn't look the same everywhere. Here's another example. You may have noticed from the map, some countries could have really surprised you as being older, having low fertility. I don't know if anyone noticed India. India was light blue. India is the country Paul Ehrlich went to and wrote the population bomb about. So if you don't know anything about this book, in 1968, it was actually published by the Sierra Club at the height of the U.S. environmental movement really budding and being concerned about population and resources. This biologist named Paul Ehrlich goes to India to study butterflies, and he said, there are no butterflies here for me to study because there's too many people. The first 2 pages of the book, he's like, people in the streets, people eating, people sleeping, people defecating, people, I mean, he goes way in detail on this. And then he says, like, people, 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 everywhere. Sure, India today has below replacement fertility. Wow, what a change in such a quick time. Now, India's population is still growing because of something we call population momentum. So if you imagine women of childbearing ages right around here,
when those cohorts are larger from when fertility rates were higher in the past, even if they have fewer than 2 children each, the population will still grow until they kind of age out of reproductive ages, but it's slowing. In fact, the number of people aging into the workforce in India has already peaked. They're on the downslope of new workers coming in, which is really astonishing. So what's special about the way that, we don't know a lot about aging and shrinking populations generally. We can borrow from the Black Death. This is not very useful for us today. That's it. We can look at maybe Eastern European populations shrinking after the fall of the wall. But it was for different reasons than we're seeing today on a large scale. What we have today is a set of countries that are not yet wealthy, that are aging, and they're aging so rapidly. So this is a number of years it took for the population aged 60 plus to double from 15% to 30%. It will have taken Ireland 92 years. It will have taken the UK 89 years. It will have taken Germany 70 years for that to happen. India will go through that same transition in 34 years. Mexico in 32, Iran in 20, and Thailand in only 19 years. Imagine 19 years is a blink of an eye to me. I've been here almost 16, and the population is aging that rapidly because fertility rates fell so quickly in countries that are not yet rich. We do not know what that means. We do not know what it means to simultaneously deal with a currently young population that you have to educate and provide jobs for, and just around the corner have to make sure that there are care systems in place for them in their old age and ways to support families or deal with retirement. So this is a whole different set of challenges than we've ever had before. It also, though, may be a set of opportunities, because many of these states that are aging rapidly now, they don't have big social welfare systems like European states did, and they're having to deal with how do we walk back our social welfare systems that we can't fund anymore. Perhaps there's some opportunity there to put something sustainable in place, because you can see what's coming. So there's both. Now, there's one more way I want to make this point about the same trend not looking the same everywhere. So when I was in the mid-2000s, I worked for the Pentagon, as Robin mentioned, in the Office of Policy. And so I was in the strategy office that looks at, how should we be thinking forward, looking at all these long-term trends. And the common refrain at that time was, Russia's population is going to be the end of the country. So this is a time in the mid-2000s when the population was already shrinking by about 500,000 people a year. They made headlines all the time for really high male mortality and low life expectancy. You may remember some of this, particularly for alcohol. So alcohol was such a bad issue. I think male life expectancy was 58 or 56. It's in the book somewhere. It was really low. And there was the sense that this would mean that Russia would not be that big of a threat on the global stage. This went all the way to the top. So I left the Pentagon in 2008, and in 2009, Robert Gates, which was one of the secretaries of defense I worked for, he published an article in Foreign Affairs magazine that said, as an old Sovietologist, I can tell you Russia's population will be the end of this country. I had a hunch that that is not exactly how demography worked. And I ran the very quick back of the envelope numbers at that time, which said, if we look at all the countries in the world that are old, so I used the year 2000 because we were pretty close to that. Who are our old countries? And I just used median age 35 or higher. All but 3 of those countries were democracies. And I think what we were doing was taking, here's what we know about aging, and putting it on this new set of aging countries. We, of course, know, actually 1 month before this book came out, Russia invaded Ukraine. And I think this argument about democracy really matters, and it means that aging doesn't look the same everywhere. If we count the number of aged countries in 2020, obviously there are far more of them in 2020 than in 2000, but a quarter are non-democracies. A quarter of the world's aging countries are non-democracies. So they don't have the same kind of checks on power. They don't have the same set of priorities. Taking care of an aging population is probably not high on their agenda. And they also don't have the same respect for human rights. So this is a question I get on a lot of podcasts lately, is really thinking about when countries see population as a problem, they look for a solution. Solutions look very different in non-democracies than they look in democracies. And so I think this is something I want us to really flag and look with eagle eyes at. It doesn't mean that you're guaranteed in a democracy either, but your chances are higher in a non-democracy. So these are our 3 big myths about global population. And where do we go from here? Well, we looked at how rapidly the global population grew last century. We'll hit our peak this century. Some of us will be alive to see it, some of us will not. We don't know exactly when it will happen. I kind of argue it doesn't really matter when exactly it happens, because that global level is becoming less and less interesting to us, and the national level much more interesting. We'll peak somewhere between 8 and 10 billion. And here's how we'll know the difference. How fast does fertility come down in the few states where it's still really high? Does it keep going down in places where it's already low? For a long time, UN demographers thought it would come back up. So projections that were done when I first started studying this, you looked at the assumptions, they assumed it would climb because they thought, oh wait, it's going to stay this low. That's weird. Why is it so low? And now it has not only not come up, it has gone even lower. So I personally would not expect us to get to 10. And really that's just not that many more, but really differential growth. So I'm trying to move the conversation around the world towards thinking less about how to change those dials and thinking more about how to adapt to the population that we actually have. So I have really, like the next book that I'm writing, it's not about the global, it's about the very local, like literally what we're doing here. Because there seems to be such a limit on what national governments can do to adapt to populations, but there's a ton that communities can do to say, this is who we have, this is what we have, and now how do we deal with that? So we have to think about things like housing. The most kind of boring stuff is coming up as important, like zoning laws. Zoning laws can prevent you from building a mother-in-law suite in your yard so that you can take care of an aging family. So forget national level policy helping you with long-term care infrastructure. Can you talk about zoning at the local level to make sure you've got these multi-generational communities? Why were those zoning laws like that in the first place? Often as reactions to migration, actually. So, there's that part. Schools. We might bring in, welcome our refugee neighbors at the national level. Are there resources in the schools to deal with helping them in the best way possible in the classroom? If there aren't, you're actually going to see a huge political backlash to the fact that they're there in the first place. So forget the national level policy, what kind of resources are we getting even in our schools? And then of course the way we interact with one another. We have seen a huge decline in religiosity worldwide. I'm sure this is something you all know. But nothing has stepped in to fill that void. And we actually see this, I believe that's a huge reason why fertility rates are so much lower. And it also means that we don't have the same kind of multi-generational care that we had in the past. So whatever we can do to strengthen our communities is really going to help all of us navigate this unprecedented global demographic transition. Now you can find me on X. I barely post anything, but I'm there. But follow me on LinkedIn. And for now I have a newsletter. I got to figure out how to work I'll transition this somehow with the new job. But I'm around on the internet and in Memphis for another few weeks. But thank you all so much, and I'm happy to take lots of questions now.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, you mentioned Russia because one of the aspects that's come up about the Ukraine war is that so many of Russian, apparently young men have left the country. That how does, first of all, the war deaths and then the exodus of this population, how does that affect the country?
It will have effects for decades to come, of course. obviously when anytime young people leave a country, it's gonna pressure, that he'll turn down that fertility dial generally, and so will concern about the future. That was one of the first, it's funny because the organization I just stepped in to lead on Wednesday, I remember in the mid-2000s going to that organization to learn about why Eastern European fertility was so low. And that, what I learned that day was people had no hope in the future. Reproduction is the ultimate hope in the future when you have control over it, saying, ah yes, come on into this world. So it's gonna affect them for a long time. Here's the funny thing though, they're still attracting lots of migrants. So lots of folks coming into work, particularly from the stands. Young men are coming into work. They're not necessarily staying there, but they have migration going both ways. Which is that unusual to have? Not. I think that to this degree it is when the place is in conflict, but they're not in conflict there so much, so you can still come in and work. So no, I mean, there's always this in and out flow.
Don't you think it'd be better if we started reproducing in our own country and keeping the migrants to their own country?
This is tough.
It's indigenous to our own country to protect our own people.
I would say that's the most common view. That is the most common view around the world. South Korea, for example, even when South Korea is bringing in migrants, their plan is to bring in South Koreans, ethnic South Koreans who live elsewhere, and bring them into the country.
Bring them back home.
They're bringing them back to the country. And, it's going to be really tough to have a policy, though, that says, let's have more babies. This is something all these low fertility countries are trying. The national government telling you to have more babies is not something that personally resonates with a lot of people, no matter where you live. It's really tough, so it's not sticking to that degree. I think that it's a good question though, because if we think about how do you adapt to population aging, I picture it as a menu. You can pick, it's like appetizers, main courses, have it made a different way. You're gonna do a little bit of immigration maybe, and which kind? You got many ways to choose from. Immigration is really different around the world. You want a temporary, skills-based, family reunification, name how you want your chicken fried. You're gonna have some raising of retirement ages. You're gonna have, adaptation on technology, AI, etc. So I think to think really broadly about it as a menu of choices is really important for each country. No question.
I just have a comment.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you. I find all of this fascinating. I'm an ESL teacher, so yeah, I teach English as a second language for Montessori United Schools. And just since October, we've received 1,500 new students. So a lot of times when they're coming to Tennessee, it is Nashville in terms of world relief, resettling refugees, but we get a lot too, and it is very political.
Yeah.
We have very little supports for them, and even in terms of like what language assessment we use to assess our success in the program, we just adopted a new one, which had a lot of controversy. Why? It's not a well-known, but it's kind of coming out that they exit students quicker, which means they have to fund less for these students, hire less ESL teachers. So yes, it becomes very political on how can we support these schools, like these students and families in the school and in the community.
That is so important. And I mean, so I've seen this even elsewhere in the Northeast. I have a friend who teaches 5th grade, and 20 students, 5 refugees from all kinds of different places, and they've been through a lot of personal trauma.
Exactly.
So there's some issues in the classroom with zero support, not a soul in there to help her. So the other parents of the other 15 students then are now having a backlash against them. So what did it do? It created more division, and even less support for something that needed more support.
Right, and a lot of our classroom teachers aren't trained in how to academically support them, much less mental health issues and the acculturation process and the trauma. So, yeah, I mean, who's in office in the state of Tennessee matters in terms of what kind of support we can get in our local school system.
That is a great point. Okay, look, one more time for people in the back. Who's in office in the state of Tennessee matters for what kind of support you get in your local school system. Yeah, for sure.
What do you mean by how sex, death, and
migration shape our world.
What do you mean by section
Yeah,
gender
just
or
for,
section
no,
population?
no, and that's a good question. So,
So
like,
it's
there's
gender,
strong
right?
gender themes here for sure.
How
I mean,
gender defined.
But we're really thinking about number of children born per woman, but the gender themes they're really strong, because then you might say, well, why are fertility rates so low? And a lot of things come up there. South Korea, for example, I mentioned how low it is. There's a huge feminist movement to the institution of marriage as it is in South Korea. It's called 4Bs movement, where young women are just opting out. They're like, we don't want any part of this system. South Korea is a country where it's rare to have children outside of marriage. Just like 3% of births, I think, are outside of marriage. So if you don't want to get married, then you will not have more children.
Yeah, so a couple weeks ago, we had a speaker who was talking to us about climate change, all the things. And we ended up having a conversation with some folks in the room about like this, people who are parents and people who are not parents saying, and just with the environmental lens, it's hard to kind of make sense of where's the hope in the future, why would I bring a child into this world, and is that child then a burden on a system that's overtaxed? So we had this whole conversation about what you were saying about like the optimism or hopefulness about the future impacting not a policy, but like my decision in my house, you know, with my family. So just to kind of flag that and connect those dots with this other conversation that's unfolding. And it's totally separate, so it's just, that's a comment, and then a question. So several years ago, around 2020, when it was time for the census, all of the headlines were about, like, how are we actually counting? Like, who's getting counted, and, you know, internal machinations to count and not count. And I just wonder how much the counting the body, like the actual people, shapes some of this in terms of, are the numbers real, accurate, you know?
That is such a good question. So I use those big, broad numbers and big, broad trends. That small margin of error doesn't matter so much, because you're looking at what is the sea change in the trend. That is an incredibly important question.
If you're talking locally.
If you're talking locally. So the organization that I just became the head of, they actually contract with Census to fix some of that. That's actually part of what they do. And here's an example. So we do work in California funded by the Annie Casey Foundation. I would love to have a Memphis Foundation fund us to do the same thing for Memphis, because I've heard from nonprofits here that have a really hard time making the case that why their services are needed because the counts are so off. So if anybody has that connection, like we can do the same thing. We produced a booklet called Kids Count. So the Casey Foundation funds PRB to go through and scrub the census data to get a more accurate count for situation of children in California, so that you can deliver better social services for that. I would say stay tuned for this next one as well, because while I am not up on everything that this PRB has done on the census yet, it is clear that it's always been controversial. How do you count ethnicities? It's a political issue. It's redone every 10 years, just about. And you can look at that historically, and how so? Because the people elected in office determine how we count these different categories, and that we are not finished with those kinds of counts, those kinds of issues as well. So I think it just makes organizations like PRB all the more important for us to be able to have accurate counts so that we can deliver better social services. Yes.
I kind of want to spin off of Sasha. So Sasha and I have our children both enrolled at Snowden, and I've not been a teacher, but thanks be to God, rolling off as the PTO president on Tuesday for 2 years. But thank you. But it's been phenomenal to be so engaged at Snowden, and just on a local level, I want to say that I kind of stumbled upon this very small person's role in this school district that, and I have a child that, I have two of my 3 kids currently have IEPs. One of them has a dual IEP. But my point being is, like, she's talking about how little these ESL students have as far as advocacy. Of course, their parents, like, maybe don't even speak the language, understand the culture. And then we have the other set of students that are from here, but, like, there is, on a local level, and, like, Calvary would be such a great support for this, just, there's a, what's it called, like, remember I shared about it. There's a way to go and get trained and be an advocate, you're like you can do the IEP thing, and like you can be someone's like adoptive parent, essentially. Like you can
if you have any experience with having, just raised children in schools or whatever, you can go and get this special training to go, and then whether it's a child in foster care or parents who just need someone else to come in and sit in the meeting, or it's people like in ESL situations, like you legally can become a person that can be this like supplemental help. And like my husband and I are decently bright people, and like figuring out the IEP for our son was like one of the most traumatic experiences of my life, and so I definitely plan to try to do this. So I want to tell you all about it, and then I'll tell you about it when I go to the training, and I'll bring all y'all with me. But the other thing I want to know is we have this new superintendent, and we have this new mayor. And you're talking about like, just these, I'm just curious of your opinion of like where on a local level, because sure, Nashville is like, appears to be so against us. But I feel very encouraged on a local level, like there's like really decent human beings in a position now to make quality zoning laws or.
Right. I think it is a matter of making, for the mayor, it's drinking from a fire hose right now, and how do you set priorities? And so the loudest voices are going to win on that priority setting. Now I know that there is an Office of Multicultural Affairs there that I've spoken with. So one of the things that I facilitated and am now moving. So somebody else, and here you go. I feel kind of bad about this. There is such a thing called the World Affairs Council. I travel around and speak to different ones. There's a Tennessee one, and it is in Nashville. So the World Affairs Council does not really help Memphis at all. So we've got a group of folks who are, and you can all be included on this. In fact, if Robin can give you my email, or you can find me on my website and just send me a message, like under the contact me, it comes to my email. I'll stick you on the list, and I'm handing that off to a Rhodes graduate, Ryan Rosenkrantz, and then a group of a steering committee for that. So things like raising awareness. That sounds like I'm backing way up, but there are community groups that can say, hey, we're a global city. Hey, we have all these people living here. And so I just popped into their multicultural affairs meeting to tell them about this, and the screen is full of people that we don't think of always as Memphians, as Memphis, as the face of the city. And I think they're well aware of that. That's a great spot to talk about how we need support for things like ESL in the classroom. So you just got to be loud and you got to be organized.
What is that group called?
Which one?
The one you were mentioning.
It's called World Affairs Council. And I'll take.
So
yeah,
there is one here.
Well, they're about to be. We're just going to do a branch off of it rather than start another one. So paperwork. But yeah, it's basically saying, how do you bring together public and private sector to say Memphis is a global city? Let's be global. And it doesn't negate the local. It amplifies the local. And there's so many, of course, groups like that. But I think our nonprofits are so overwhelmed, obviously, that just finding ways to amplify the voices and come together more it makes a huge difference. Yes.
I'm kind of interested in religion. And I was curious as I was watching the slides go by, places I wouldn't, the big picture I would assume is that as religion goes more and more conservative, there's fewer rights for women, I would align that with, I'm guessing those would be the countries. Some of those countries though that were really crushing are like Iran, and I don't think that is a bastion of women's rights. So could you say something about how maybe, not from one religion to the other, but maybe how religion might affect that?
Yes. So birth patterns particularly?
Yeah.
Yes. Most certainly it is the case that I would say we don't even have to say conservative. We can just say more religious.
Yeah.
The more religious communities have higher fertility rates. So different groups in the U.S., like the Mormons, have higher fertility rates than the average American group. Why is that the case? From most demographers kind of land on the fuzzy idea about community. So, church is a place you can go where you can have your kids in this building right now and you don't have to watch them. In an era, in a context in which we have incredibly intensive parenting, right? We're expected to be, you don't let them off of a tether. That's the cultural expectation right now. So that becomes really important. It also matters what looks normal to you. So if we take Israel, for example, not everyone in Israel is highly religious. There's a strong secular Jewish community there. But the secular Jewish community in Israel has higher fertility rates than kind of their socioeconomic peers in the US or in Europe. Why might that be the case? Demographers have hypothesized, at least, that what looks normal for family size there matters. So the ultra-Orthodox have very high fertility rates. So it's not uncommon to see big families, to see people out with children, to have strollers everywhere, to have family-friendly restaurants. So there's slightly higher fertility rates even among secular populations because what looks normal, and we all know this from our own personal, like that makes intuitive sense for us. Like, what looks strange to you if somebody has or doesn't have kids, and you know, your own life choices. I got married very young, and I was the last of my friend group to get married. It was normal for me to be married at 23. Say that now to somebody living, you know, a young lady my age in Washington, D.C. would say that is the craziest thing that she's heard of. That does not look normal. So I think those norms matter, and within religion that matters. You're probably also thinking, what about the existential issue as well? And I think that's powerful. You know, a lot of religions, they will exhort people to have more children, to continue the tradition of religion. It is powerful, but then when you add in the education variable there, that's when it gets really messy because, you know, just the same way that having a baby for the good of your country doesn't help answer coming in at 3 a.m. when they've got a fever and you're exhausted. Also having a baby, you know, for the religion and, you know, one for me, one for God or something, they don't come in the middle of the night and help you with those issues. So I think there's some limits to that, but if you add all of those pieces together that I just mentioned, you can throw them all together and then you see reasons why it might give it a bump. But Iran is really interesting. You want to talk about this a little more? You know, it was a very powerful thesis that rapidly growing populations would have economic problems several decades ago. So despite the conservatism of Iran's religious leaders, they said, we actually think it's going to be worse off if we have a really rapidly growing population. It'll be hard to govern, it'll be hard to grow the economy. So they put family planning clinics everywhere. And it fell so quickly. And so now there's a movement to try and raise it. But that infrastructure, those norms, and that education and those expectations are already there among women and, you know, in couples. So depends on how heavy the hand comes in to change that as to whether or not you'll actually see it go up.
First of all, thank you. This is all so fascinating, and I'm thinking about a lot of things, but two questions, I guess, specifically. One, you mentioned the piece by Robert Gates, and I'm wondering if any of this work does help us to forecast areas of global conflict in the future, and if so, what would you say about that? And second, just a more local sort of question, and it sounds like a sort of question that you're asked all the time. How do we get people to move here? Like, how do we get people to actually move to Memphis? I mean, obviously, Atlanta, Nashville, Dallas, all these other places have boomed over the last 20, 30 years. We've been relatively stagnant. So,
great questions. So one for conflict, it is really useful. You see the red here? We know that these countries are much more likely to experience coups while they're young. So countries where a median age of 25 or lower are much more likely to experience coups than countries that are older. And I'm sure that makes intuitive sense as well. So if you want to forecast, let's say you're a multinational company or the U.S. Defense Department, the multinational company wants to not be where conflict is. The Defense Department might want to be close enough to where conflict is to keep it from spreading. So if you're thinking about where do I build a base or what relationships do I foster in terms of alliances to maybe prop up allies in the region to make sure that they're anchors of stability there, you need to be looking at those areas. So those countries have a higher likelihood of breaking out into civil conflict. Interstate war, there is not a great relationship between population change and interstate war. Now, part of this may be how we have had to study it the number of countries that were Asian was so small. It's not like you can really run statistical analysis on this. I put zero stock in those studies, as I have said in peer review many times. And it's not always intuitive. Look at China. Their population is shrinking. They're one of the world's most rapidly aging countries. Does that mean that they're becoming the wallflower of global politics? No, it does not. Even Japan, which is, again, like we said, one of the world's oldest countries, they've been moving to beef up their defense to the extent that their constitution will allow. Because look at where they're located, right next to China, Russia, North Korea, and the US hanging out over here. So I think that's much harder. As far as a local level goes, I would say for Memphis specifically, it would be how to get people not to leave. And I know that sounds weird since I'm about to leave. And our friend group has seen like a lot of people go. Not losing people might even be a better strategy than trying to attract them to come. Although, if you could, if I were in charge of marketing for the city of Memphis, I would target specifically people in Nashville who want to be somewhere fun like that, but can't afford it. I mean, I would probably make a specific campaign just acting like this, and I would like name a neighborhood and be like, this is Little Nashville. And I would probably just pretend like that's the case. And that's all that they come here. That's has nothing to do with demography or really anything. But it's just something so that's not an expert on this at all, but that's what I would do. You just gotta keep people from moving, and people are moving because I think there's a sense that the city is not on an upswing. It's been on a downswing. And we were talking about how confident do people feel in the future. We got to say we are confident in the future. So I do not end on a negative note. Let's take some of the momentum of freshness, of new people in, and remembering to strengthen those community bonds, and then Memphis can be the strong anchor here.
Thank you.
Thank you.